Magnus Carlsen is the greatest chess player of all time, but Hans Niemann still hasn't figured it out. He said he would smoke Magnus Carlsen in their epic one-on-one match in the Speed Chess Championship semifinals, but what happened was the total opposite. In the end, Magnus Carlsen utterly obliterated Hans Niemann. It wasn't even close, and in today's video, I'm going to show you Magnus Carlsen's 5 best games from the match where he destroyed Hans Niemann. And as an added bonus, at the end of this video, I'm showing you a bonus game from the match where Magnus Carlsen plays a brand new opening idea against Hans Niemann, one that has never been played before in the history of chess. So make sure you watch till the very end of this video to see Magnus Carlsen's new opening idea in action. All right, diving into our first game here, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white, and he tries to throw his opponent Hans Niemann off guard on move 1 with the move c4, the English opening. Now, this move is very playable, but obviously not as popular as d4 or e4 on move 1. Now, Hans Niemann, knight to f6. Here, Magnus goes knight to f3, clamping down on the e5 square. Hans Niemann had the option of going e5 immediately on move 1, but now e5 is permanently blocked as that knight does control the square. Now here Hans goes e6, potentially heading for a queen's gambit decline sort of structure, and here Magnus goes g3, the Catalan style move. So now Magnus Carlsen, his plan is going to be bishop g2, and we'll have to see if he does go d4 later in the game, transposing to a Catalan structure, or if he delays that move even permanently. Now here Hans Niemann d5, very classical move. Now Magnus goes bishop g2, bishop e7 for Hans Niemann, and both sides castle. Now this is the critical position of this opening. Here Hans Niemann is going to take on c4 next if Magnus Carlsen doesn't do anything else. So here Magnus, what is he going to do? Is he going to go d4, transposing back to a Catalan, or perhaps b3 or something else? Well, in the game here, Magnus goes for the move d3. This is a very trendy option right now. There are a lot of grandmasters playing in this style. So what's the idea? Well, first of all, that pawn on the c4 square is now defended by the pawn on the d3 square. Beyond that, white may want to go perhaps c takes d5 or even e4, breaking in the center with the e-pawn. So white here has a lot of flexibility, a lot of different options. Now here, Hans Niemann, the main move is going to be c5, but instead he throws a little bit of a curveball at Magnus Carlsen. He goes a5, expanding on the queen side. Now this is not the best move here. It doesn't fight for the center of the board quite as well as c5. However, it is very playable, and in the Catalan, black often goes a5, getting space on the queen side, so it's an interesting idea. Now Magnus Carlsen, knight to c3, a good move, developing the knight. And here black's best option is going to be d4, getting space in the center, and if white goes knight b5, then black can always go bishop c5, defending that new pawn on the d4 square. Now, instead of that, here Hans Niemann goes c6. This move is in the spirit of the semi-Slav defense, where black gets that pawn triangle in the middle of the board. However, here it wasn't necessarily the best idea. Overall, this move is a little bit slow, and now Magnus can strike in the center with the move e4, and that is exactly what he does in the game. Now here, Magnus is threatening e5 if black does nothing. From there, Magnus would be getting space on the king side, and he could potentially start a kingside attack in the spirit of the King's Indian attack opening. Now, Hans Niemann, what should he be doing about this threat of e5? Well, in the game, he basically ignores it with move knight to a6. Kind of a curious-looking move. Obviously, c6 not available for the knight, so the knight has to go there. But now Magnus just jumps in with the e5 pawn, e5 on the board. Black is forced to go knight d7, and here Magnus Carlsen already has a very significant advantage out of the opening. This is sort of a good version of a King's Indian attack or a red-eye opening for white. I mean, it's very playable for black in general, but here these moves a5, knight a6, and c6 don't really make a lot of sense in this structure. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen starts to gain space on the king side with the move h4, a very good move. Magnus may be threatening h5 in the future, maybe even h6. And beyond that, this move also sets up the idea of knight to g5. From there, white can go queen to h5, threatening checkmate on the h7 square. So overall, h4, a very good multi-purpose move by Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Hans Niemann, he continues to go astray. In the game, he goes b6. His idea, perhaps, is to go bishop b7, but overall, this is very, very slow. Instead, here, Hans Niemann simply had to go knight to c7, setting up b5 ideas, expanding on the queen side. However, after b6, his setup is just not geared towards getting counterplay on the queen side where he has the space advantage. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen continues rook to e1, defending the pawn on the e5 square, a very good move. Now knight to g5 is a possibility, as that pawn on e5 would not be hanging. Now here, Hans Niemann, bishop b7, continuing his plan, but that bishop on the b7 square is doing literally nothing in this position. It's biting on granite on d5. Perhaps Hans wants to go c5 next. Maybe that's his idea. But here, Magnus Carlsen pretty much shuts that idea down permanently. He takes on d5, c takes d5, black takes back, and then the key move d4 from Magnus Carlsen, locking in the structure in the center of the board. And here, that bishop on b7, again, is just permanently weak. Overall, Hans would likely want to have that bishop on a6 instead of b7, but now that'd be a waste of a tempo, and overall, Hans Niemann's position is just looking awful right here. Now, in the game, Hans does go bishop c6, perhaps trying to go b5 next. And here, Magnus shows his idea, knight g5, the key move we've been talking about. Now, Magnus is ready to go queen to h5, setting up checkmating ideas on the h7 square, and that is what happens. Here, Hans, b5, finally getting something going on the queen side, but Magnus jumps in with the queen to h5, threatening checkmate in one move. Obviously, Hans Niemann has to do something about this threat right here. So what are Hans Niemann's options here to defend against queen takes h7? Well, one idea is h6, that does block the check. However, here, white can simply go knight to h3, and now there are all sorts of sacrificial ideas based on bishop takes h6. That would be an absolute disaster for black. Instead, in the game, Hans Niemann perhaps plays the better idea, bishop takes g5, knocking off that knight permanently. However, to do that, he did have to give up the key dark squared bishop, and now after bishop takes g5, white's bishop is an absolute monster on the dark squares. Alright, now the queen on d8 is under attack. What should Hans do? In the game, he goes queen to e8, a perfectly reasonable move, but now Magnus, he increases the pressure with the move queen to g4. Now the threat is either bishop to f6, or even better, bishop h6, and obviously the pawn on the g7 square will be pinned. And that means Hans Niemann may be at risk of losing his rook, or perhaps even worse, getting checkmated again. Now in the game, Hans respects the threat. He goes king to h8. Again, if black ignores that, say rook b8 or any other waiting move, then bishop h6 is absolutely devastating, and that bishop cannot be taken because of the pin on the king. Now heading back to the game, king h8 on the board from Hans Niemann. Now rook a c1, Magnus Carlsen setting up threats against that bishop on the c6 square. And here Hans Niemann makes yet another key mistake, knight b6. Now his idea perhaps is to go knight c4 at some point, but this knight is now further away from the defense of the king, and that is going to be a huge problem for him. Now Magnus, how should he continue the attack? Well, it's going to be hard to win the game with just the queen and the bishop trying to checkmate black. So with that in mind, here Magnus finds a really good way to reroute the knight on the c3 square all the way over to the king side on the h5 square. Here's how he does it. Knight e2. Now Hans Niemann jumps in with his knight to the b4 square, knight b4 on the board, then knight to f4. Black takes on a2, then knight to h5. Magnus Carlsen simply going knight e2, knight f4, knight h5, and now, believe it or not, the threat is knight to f6. And if the knight plumps there, if black ever takes it on f6, then white can recapture with the bishop with check, and again, that would be effectively game over. So Hans here, rook g8, tried to defend against the threat, but Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight anyway, knight to f6 on the board. Now, here's the problem. If you take the knight, you pretty much lose on the spot. For example, g takes f6 is met by bishop takes f6, then the only way to stop the checkmate is rook g7, but then queen takes g7 is going to be checkmate. Now, what else can black do besides that? Well, the best move according to the engine is knight takes c1, but again, that doesn't deal with these threats on the queen. Magnus can literally win the queen if he wants to. In the game, Hans Niemann does go queen f8, getting the queen out of the attack of the knight, but here Magnus, queen to h5. Again, leaving the knight on pre, black can take it if he wants to, and that is what happens in the game. G takes f6. Here Magnus goes bishop takes f6. Now, of course, you have to block the check. Yeah, you have the rook or the queen. In the game, Hans Niemann does block the check with the rook, the best move. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he doesn't even have to capture the rook right away. Instead, he goes rook takes c6, capturing the bishop on the c6 square, threatening rook takes b6. And here, Hans Niemann plays one last move, knight to c4, but in this position, he's running out of time. and he literally resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen with 3 seconds left on his clock. Wow, very impressive game by Magnus Carlsen, but this next game is even crazier. All right, diving into our second game, this one's incredible. Here, Hans Niemann is playing as white, Magnus is black, and Hans Niemann heads straight for his Italian game. He loves the Italian, especially in blitz time controls. Now here, Magnus, bishop c5, standard stuff. d3, knight f6, c3, and d6 from Magnus. So far, so good. Now here, Hans castles on the king side, and Magnus goes for the move h6. This early h6 idea is getting very, very popular in the Italian in a wide variety of different positions. Now, the problem with doing this too early is white can go b4, immediately expanding on the queen side. That is probably the strongest move. Here, the main line is bishop is b4, bishop b6, a4, a5, b5, knight d7. And here, white can do what he wants, rook e1, knight d2, h3, all of these ideas. Instead, Hans Niemann ignores that idea. He goes rook to e1 in this position. Then Magnus goes a6. This does take the sting out of b4 ideas, as now the bishop does have that retreat square on the a7 square. Now from here, both sides continue developing. Knight d2, short castles for black. So far, totally standard stuff. And here the main line for white is the move a4, expanding on the queen side. The idea is to go b4 sooner or later, just gaining more space. And overall, it's a very standard Italian position. Now, instead of that, here Hans Niemann went for the move knight to f1. Hans Niemann played this idea over and over in this match. The idea is he wants to go knight f1, then knight to g3 later, without expanding on the queen side with a4 and b4. So it's an interesting idea. It's not quite as strong as the immediate a4, but Hans Niemann had a lot of ideas in this line prepared for this tournament. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen, he simply retreats his bishop back to the a7 square. I do want to point out there is this idea of knight to a5 trying to win the bishop. For example, if the bishop does go back to the b3 square, then black wins it all the same. However, the problem with this move here is white can go for the very fast b4, and this breaks up black's idea. Here, the knight has to take the bishop on c4, then you take the bishop on c5, and overall here, white is actually doing perfectly fine despite the weird pawn structure. So knight to a5, not the best idea. Magnus Carlsen just going bishop a7 in response to the early knight to f1 from Hans Niemann. Now, a couple more normal-looking moves. h3 from Hans, stopping bishop g4 ideas. Magnus goes rook to e8. And now, this was the big shocker of the game, at least for me. Bishop d2 from Hans Niemann. All right, what the heck is the idea behind this move? Well, it turns out the computer really likes it for some reason. I would have never thought that. I would have thought for sure, say, knight g3, bishop e3, a4, b4. These would be all the moves I'd be looking at here. Instead, bishop d2 doesn't really put the bishop on a good square. However, Hans has an idea. Here, Magnus goes rook to e6, a very typical looking Italian move. The idea, of course, is you're trying to challenge that bishop on c4. If white takes on e6, the rook on the e8 square is positioned to recapture. That way you win back the bishop without damaging your pawn structure. That is what happens here. Bishop takes, then rook takes from Magnus Carlsen. And here Hans Niemann does show his idea. He expands on the queen side with the move c4. Now this bishop on d2 may want to go to c3, sort of an artificial fianchetto of the bishop. So overall, that is Hans Niemann's idea. However, it's not particularly strong here, and Magnus Carlsen finds a very good antidote. He just jumps in with the knight to the d4 square. Of course, the move prior, before Hans Niemann went c4, knight d4 was not possible as that pawn does cover the square. However, now after c4, knight d4 is possible. Magnus jumps in with the knight. And the idea here is to try and trade off these knights on the d4 and the f3 square. And then after that, Magnus Carlsen did free the way to go c6 and potentially d5, challenging white's pawn center in the middle of the board. Now here, if Hans Niemann takes the knight on d4, the bishop on a7 is perfectly placed to recapture. Bishop takes d4, and black would have zero problems. Instead, Hans Niemann goes knight g3 in the game. And then Magnus Carlsen, instead of taking on f3, that would be the quote-unquote solid move. Instead, he mixes things up and expands on the queen side with a very aggressive-looking move, b5. So Magnus here showing his intentions. He wants a complicated game where he can play for a win. He thinks he's just the better player in this matchup. Hans Niemann is just not on his level in his own mind. Now, from here, the threat is very obvious. Magnus Carlsen is threatening b takes c4. Then after d takes c4, Hans Niemann will have one more central pawn, and that would give him slightly better control over the center of the board. Now, here, Hans Niemann does have a wide variety of moves he can play. He can allow it. For example, the computer loves the idea of b4. Also, b3 is possible, just bolstering the pawn on the c4 square. Instead, Hans Niemann goes for his main idea, bishop to c3, developing the bishop on this long diagonal here. However, the whole idea looks a little bit suspicious. Here, black has those pawns on c7, d6, and e5, and they all block in the bishop. This is essentially a bad bishop on the c3 square here. Now here, the best idea for Magnus Carlsen, there's a very clever idea the computer sees. You take on f3 with the knight, white takes back with the queen, and then you actually go g6. This move looks a little bit weird, but without the bishop on this diagonal here, that pawn on the h6 square is perfectly fine. Black can always go king g7, defending it next. And the benefit of this g6 move is it does lock down on that f5 square, stopping knight to f5 ideas from Hans Niemann. And without that move, Hans Niemann really doesn't have a very good plan in this position. Now instead, Magnus Carlsen starts by taking on the c4 square, b takes c4 on the board. Hans Niemann takes back with the d-pawn, d takes c4. Then Magnus trades on f3, knight takes, queen takes, and once again, the top computer idea is g6, again stopping knight to f5 ideas and taking advantage of the fact the bishop is on this diagonal here instead of the original one on c1 to h6. Now, instead of that, here Magnus goes knight d7, kind of a curious looking move. Let's see what his idea is. Now Magnus jumps in with the knight to the f5 square. Very good square for the knight. Garry Kasparov once said a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn. So that piece may be the strongest piece on the board right now. But here Magnus, this is his idea of knight d7. He goes rook to f6, pinning the knight on f5 to the queen. And now white has to be super careful. For example, in the future, black may have g6 ideas. And technically, the knight is now pinned and he could lose the knight. So, of course, Hans Niemann, he sees this, queen to e2, and now Magnus plays a couple of very precise moves. First of all, king to h7. The idea of this move is in the future, if he wants to go g6, then that pawn on h6 is defended, so now g6 is an option. Then Hans Niemann rook ad1, centralizing the rook, good idea. And finally, Magnus goes a5, expanding on the queen side, and this move is especially strong as it stops the idea of b4 for white. For example, if white did that now, then he'd have an absolutely ruined pawn structure on the queen side. And of course, that pawn on e5 is not hanging, as if Hans Niemann does take it with bishop takes a5, then black has the response, bishop takes f2, followed by picking up the bishop on the a5 square, as bishop takes f2 does put the king in check. And from there, white's pawn structure on the king side is going to be damaged, so that is simply no good. So now Hans Niemann, he sees the idea. He goes king to h1, getting out of this line of attack of the bishop. So now bishop takes a5 is actually a legitimate threat. However, this move may not have been the best idea for Hans Niemann. The problem with it is now the pawn on f2 is only defended by the queen. Now we can see if the knight on f5 ever moves, then both the bishop and the rook will be piling up on that pawn on the f2 square. Yes, Hans Niemann can go back to the e3 square with the knight, but overall is not ideal, and that is what happens here. Magnus goes g6, knight to e3 from Hans Niemann, and here Magnus Carlsen finds a brilliant way to get a good knight versus a bad bishop middle game. First he goes rook to e6, a normal move. Hans Niemann finally goes rook to f1, increasing defense of that pawn. Perhaps he wants to go f4 next, and here Magnus strikes immediately. First, bishop takes e3. Now, typically, you don't want to give up your bishop in the middle game for a knight unless you have a very good reason to do it, and here Magnus does. Hans Niemann takes back with the queen, and then the key move, g5 from Magnus Carlsen, clamping down on the dark squares on the king side. Of course, now f4 is simply impossible. Black could take back with the g-pawn or the e-pawn. That would be an absolute disaster. But beyond that, look at this bishop on c3 compared to Magnus Carlsen's knight on d7. Here the bishop is literally biting on granite, hitting those pawns on e5, d6, and c7 is doing absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the knight has the option of getting back into the game on the dark squares. One option is knight to f8, then g6, then f4. The other option is knight b8, then c6, and d4. Either way, d4 or f4, the knight's going to be a monster, and the bishop, at least for the foreseeable future, really isn't doing anything for Hans Niemann. So now we know Magnus Carlsen's plan, rerouting the knight to a better square. However, Hans Niemann has his own ideas. He wants to gain space on the queen side where he has that 3 versus 2 pawn majority. Now Hans b3, then c5 for Magnus Carlsen, again, further clamping down on the dark squares in this position. A very good idea. Now from here, both sides play a series of maneuvering moves. Not a whole lot happens, so we're going to skip through a little bit. Here, Magnus starts his rerouting of the knight. It goes knight to b8. However, this may have been a little bit problematic. Here, Hans Niemann actually is ready for the pawn break f4, expanding on the king side, and there's a key tactical resource that makes it all possible. Here, f4 is actually the key move for Hans. Now, at first glance, this move looks problematic. For example, black can capture on f4 with the e-pawn, and then after g takes f4, he can win the pawn on the e4 square. However, here, Hans has a series of very good moves available. First of all, queen d3, pinning the rook to the king. That is one of the main ideas. Then if the king moves, you have this really good deflection idea, bishop to f6. And of course, if the queen takes the bishop, then the queen takes the rook on the e4 square. And from here, Hans Niemann actually has a very good initiative, all of his pieces working together. And the big problem for black is that knight on the c8 square is completely out of the game for now. It takes at least 1 or 2 more moves for it to be on a good square. So all this to say, the move f4 on move 29 would have been simply outstanding for Hans Niemann. Instead, he misses it. He goes rook to d5, and here Magnus slowly takes over in the game. He starts knight c6. Now the threat, of course, is knight d4, trapping the rook on the d5 square. And here Hans Niemann sort of ignores the threat. Queen d2, then the knight jumps in. Now the knight on d5 is basically entombed on that square. Fortunately, Magnus Carlsen doesn't have a light spread bishop to win it. If he did, that rook would be a goner. But then queen d3 for Hans Niemann. This is a very good move, setting up various x-ray ideas on the king on the h7 square. And beyond that, Hans Niemann actually lays a trap with this move, and Magnus Carlsen misses it. He simply goes rook to a8. Instead of that, he had to get his king out of this x-ray attack of the queen. He had to go king to g7 or something similar. And here's why. Instead, rook to a8 on the board for Magnus Carlsen as black, and then Hans Niemann shows his idea. Bishop takes d4, an excellent move. Here's the idea. Black cannot take with the e-pawn. E takes d4 would be the right idea, but the problem is here Hans Niemann can actually go e5 with check, hitting the king with the queen, and then follow up either e takes d6 or rook takes d6. And overall, in this position, with the transformation of the pawn structure, Hans Niemann is doing excellent. His queen on d3 does a fantastic job of blockading that pawn on the d4 square. So all this to say, after bishop takes d4, e takes d4 is not possible because of that e5 threat. Instead, c takes d4 is the move for black, but then Hans Niemann rook c1, setting up c5 ideas. And once again, Hans Niemann's piece is starting to look pretty good. The rook on d5 goes from being entombed to being quite active. And again, the queen on d3 does a great job of blockading that pass pawn on the d4 square. Now from here, Hans Niemann does have a little bit of an advantage. Magnus Carlsen needs to defend for a little bit. And both sides play some normal developing moves. Hans Niemann trying to expand on the queen side, and Magnus Carlsen regrouping and playing a little bit defensively. We're going to keep fast forwarding all the way to this position right here. This is the next critical position in the middle game. Here, Hans Niemann is getting anxious. He wants to break through. He goes for the move c5, but it turns out this is a little bit premature. Now, the idea of the move is obvious. Hans Niemann is trying to get a breakthrough on the queen side. His rook is lined up with the queen, which is good for him. The problem, though, is here black has the resource d5, and that is what Magnus Carlsen finds. Now, as these pawns get liquidated here, Magnus Carlsen is going to have those 2 pass pawns in the center of the board. Or sorry, the 1 pass pawn on d4 and the other pawn on e5 supporting it, and those pawns can start rolling down the board. Now, this is what happens. Rook b6 from Hans Niemann, but here, Magnus Carlsen, does he defend the queen on the c6 square? No, he plays the strong intermediate move, d takes e4, hitting the queen. Now here, if Hans takes the queen on c6, Magnus Carlsen takes the queen on d3, and then those pawns are just rolling down the board. There is no stopping them. So instead, queen c4 on the board for Hans Niemann, but then Magnus Carlsen finds a series of very precise moves. First of all, queen to c8. Then the rooks come off the board. Rook takes, king takes. Hans Niemann goes queen d5. And here Magnus Carlsen has one move to convert his advantage, and he finds it. d3, getting the pawns rolling. Now, of course, the rook is being hit with check. Hans Niemann is forced to play a little bit defensively here. The best move is going to be something like rook d2 or rook c1 or rook b2. Instead, he goes rook to c4, missing the idea in time trouble. And here, Magnus Carlsen once again finds the only move to crash through. Queen d8, trying to force the queens off the board. Now, if Hans Niemann does take the queen on the d8 square, queen takes d8, then he's basically lost in the rook endgame. After rook takes d8, the idea for Magnus Carlsen is very simple. King to e6, then king d5, putting pressure on the rook and the pawn. His king is going to be in a great position to stop these passed pawns for Hans Niemann and gobble up the queen side. Meanwhile, his pawns in the middle of the board are going to crash through. So, of course, queen takes d8, not the move for Hans Niemann. Instead, he plays queen takes e4, but Magnus Carlsen doesn't mind. He goes d2, trying to crash through with the pawn. Now, of course, the threat is d1, promoting to a queen. The rook cannot stop it. Hans Niemann tries his best. He gives a check to the king, queen to f3, king g7, then queen d1. Literally the only way to stop the pawn. But now Magnus jumps in with the queen, queen d5, hitting the king. The king retreats. Then a4, a deflection move. If Hans Niemann takes the pawn on the a4 square, then queen takes c4 wins the rook for Hans Niemann. So, of course, b takes a4 not possible. Here, Hans Niemann retreats the rook back to the c2 square, but then a takes b3 wins yet another pawn for Magnus Carlsen. Now, rook takes d2 wins that first pass pawn, but queen c4, and now this b pawn is in a position where it might promote. Now, of course, here, both sides are in extreme time pressure. Hans Niemann goes rook d7, and Magnus, he has the winning idea, b2, he misses it in time trouble. Instead, rook takes a3, simply winning the pawn, then rook d6 from Hans, but finally Magnus finds the idea, b2, pushing the pawn. Now the threat is either rook to a1, pinning the queen, or queen to c1. Again, if the queen's trade, then the pawn promotes. And here Hans Niemann in time trouble. He tries to get his queen out of this pin. He goes queen to f3, not realizing that puts you in the line of attack for the rook. Here Magnus Carlsen, he simply picks up the queen on the f3 square. And Hans Niemann, in shame, realizes what happens and he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. All right, diving into our third game. Here, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and here Hans Niemann, he goes for the Sicilian defense with the move 1c5. Now, this is a big surprise for me. When Hans Niemann is playing against Magnus Carlsen or Hikaru or other top grandmasters, he typically responds 1e5, trying to head for a Berlin defense. Instead, the move c5 on the board. This means Hans Niemann is looking for a fight in this game. Now from here, Magnus knight to f3, d6 from Hans, and instead of the open Sicilian with the move d4, Hans would probably go for a knight over Sicilian. Instead, the move bishop b5 on the board by Magnus Carlsen. This is the Moscow variation. The idea is very simple. You want to give that king on the e8 square a check, then go short castles, and then eventually go probably c3 and d4, trying to get that typical pawn structure in the center. Now here, Hans Niemann has a choice, either knight d7 or bishop d7 to block the check. In the game, Hans goes for the more combative option, knight d7. And from here, Magnus starts his idea of trying to get that pawn center on d4 at e4. He goes c3, setting up d4 next. So now Hans, what is he going to do about it? Knight to f6, hitting the pawn on the e2 square. Now Magnus is basically forced to go either queen to e2 or bishop d3. Surprisingly, bishop d3 is a playable move. The idea is to go to d3, then back to c2 at some point, and then finally d4 later, but instead queen e2 on the board. This is a very solid idea. The queen does support the pawn on the e2 square, and from there, white's going to castle, go rook d1, so rook f d1, and d4. And it's a little bit different having the queen on e2 and the rook on d1. Typically, in these 1e4 openings, white keeps the queen on d1 for a little while, then brings the other rook to e1. So I'll be covering the subtleties of this kind of position as we go along. Here, Hans Niemann, a6, hitting the bishop. Magnus retreats. Then b5, bishop c2. And here, Hans Niemann has a big choice. He has to figure out how he wants to develop his king side. Specifically, the problem is that dark squared bishop on the f8 square. Here, black has three main ideas to do that. One is e6, more of a Scheveningen style move. The other is e5 in the spirit of the Najdorf or the Stejnikov Sicilian. And finally, there's the move g6, intending bishop g7 in the spirit of the dragon. Now, Hans Niemann delays this decision for one more move. In the game, he goes bishop b7, putting pressure on that pawn on the e4 square. Currently, it is defended, and that gives Magnus the time he needs to go d4 very quickly. So we have Magnus castles, and then Hans goes e6, showing his intentions. He wants to go bishop e7, then short castles in the spirit of the Scheveningen. The problem with this move, or not the problem, more the drawback of this setup, is it does allow a very fast d4 from white. Magnus does get it in, d4 on the board, and here Magnus, he maybe has a very slight advantage. He does have that pawn center in the middle of the board. However, overall, Hans Niemann will be able to strike at some point with the move e5, something like that, and it will transpose to more of a Roy Lopez style position for black, where he should be relatively okay. Now here, the best plan for Hans Niemann is going to be bishop d7, followed by short castles. Instead, he delays castling for one more move. He goes queen to c7. Now, the drawback of this move, of course, is that Hans Niemann is not getting his king castled. And here, Magnus does have a way to exploit the idea. He can go a4 immediately. Now, the challenge of this move for Hans Niemann as black is you would want the rooks on the a8 square and the f8 square connected if he had already castled. Here, that isn't possible. And for example, black does encounter some tactical problems if he tries to castle the best move. And here, Magnus can go e5 immediately, creating problems in the middle of the board. I don't want to go into it too much, but this is the line to take advantage of Hans Niemann's inaccurate move, queen to c7 in this position. Again, instead, bishop e7, followed by castles immediately was the idea. Now here, Magnus, instead of going d4, spinning on the queen side, he goes bishop d3. Now, this is a very curious-looking move. The idea, one, is he's putting pressure on the b5 pawn. For example, if he goes a4 later, then both his bishop and his queen are piling up on that pawn. And beyond that, Magnus is sort of egging Hans on to go for the break c4, expanding on the queen side. So, for example, if Hans went c4, it would force the bishop back to the c2 square. However, it does release the tension in the center, and now those pawns on d4 and e4 are even more powerful than they were before. So bishop d3 by Magnus is sort of a weird, undeveloping move, sort of begging Hans to go c4. Now, Hans Niemann is no dummy. He doesn't fall for the idea, at least not yet. He goes bishop b7, intending short castles, and now the whole a4 idea from white isn't that big of a deal, as black is castling on the next move. Now here, Magnus, he goes knight d2, the best square for the knight. From here, his plan may include rook to e1 or rook d1, and then knight f1 to g3 in the spirit of the Roy Lopez or the Italian openings. Now here, Magnus, once again, delays castling. Castling was likely the best move here. Instead, rook to c8, the idea being trying to increase the pressure on the c file. For example, now, if he goes c takes d4 at some point, the queen and the rook do a nice job piling up on the future open c file. However, it's not a big threat yet, as white's pawns and bishops control all the squares on the c file. So here, Magnus just expands on the queen side with the move a4. Now, Hans Niemann's next move is very interesting, but before I show you that, go ahead and do me a huge favor, Chess YouTube. Go ahead and smash that like button. It's the best thing you can help me do to get more views on this video. Please, by all means, smash that like button. And now, back to the content here. Here, black goes c4. This is a very committal idea by Hans Niemann. The idea, of course, is that bishop is being knocked back to the c2 square. Bishop c2 is Magnus Carlsen's response. But again, now that tension in the center on the pawns on d4 and e4 is released, and here Hans Niemann is going to have a much harder time challenging the center. Now, his follow-up idea is to go e5 in the spirit of the Roy Lopez opening. Now, this position almost looks like a closed Roy Lopez, where white went queen to e2 instead of rook to e1. Almost everything else is the same. Literally every other piece could be seen in a Roy Lopez. So now Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing in this kind of position? Well, again, typically the queen is going to be on d1. If that's the case, his basic plan is h3, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, and then going from there, perhaps d5 at some point. Now, of course, the queen being on the e2 square does change things, and here white has a wide variety of ideas. d5, immediately trying to block the center is possible. Beyond that, a takes b5, and even b3, trying to create something on the queen side right away is playable. Instead of that, here Magnus Carlsen plays a move that is just so typical for his games. He goes rook d1. Now, the idea behind this move, first of all, obviously, when you have the queen on e2 in these e4 openings, it's a good idea to go rook d1 next. However, beyond that, here Magnus is just maintaining the tension in the center. He's basically saying, the more tension I have in the position, the more likely my opponent, Hans Niemann, is to mess up, as he's simply not on my level in this game. And so, rook d1, the best move to maintain literally all of the options on the board. Now from here, Hans Niemann castles, Magnus goes knight f1, black goes rook to e8. Again, a very standard idea in these Ruy Lopez style moves. Perhaps black wants to go bishop f8 next, and if Hans Niemann ever takes on the d4 square with his e-pawn, then the rook will be lined up on this newly open e-file with the queen. Now, Magnus sees that, and finally in this position, he doesn't go on autopilot and go knight g3. Instead, he plays the very strong idea of d5, finally locking in the center. These pawns on d5, e4, d6, and e5 are not being traded anytime soon. And here, Magnus Carlsen actually has a very sizable advantage. Now, what is he going to be doing in this position? Well, Magnus has the option of playing on the queen side, for example, with opening up the a-file, or on the king side, perhaps with knight g3, knight to f5, maybe even like h3, g4 ideas could be playable. Now, Hans Niemann, on the other hand, playing on the king side right away is not going to be an option. He may have an opportunity to do a King's Indian-style move f5 later in the game. Stick around for that. But for right now, his main idea is in the spirit of the Barrère variation of the Ruy Lopez, where he has to go knight to c5, putting pressure on that pawn on the a4 square. So with that in mind, here Hans Niemann immediately knight c5. Again, pressuring a4, but beyond that, also pressuring, it's a weird arrow, also pressuring the pawn on the e4 square. Now here, Magnus, he has the option of releasing the tension on the a-file. A takes b5 is possible, but instead here, he simply goes h3. A decent preparatory move on the king side. This turns out to be the strongest idea, and the reason for this is knight takes a4 and b takes a4 are actually not good moves for black, surprisingly. And here Hans Niemann, he actually falls for the trap. He takes on b4 with the pawn. Now, this is a very standard idea in the Ruy Lopez. It typically works out. However, here, it was not the best idea. It's actually a big blunder. And now Magnus Carlsen has a very sizable advantage if he follows up precisely. Real fast, instead of this, here black should have simply gone g6, a very common move in the Barrère, perhaps following up bishop f8, bishop g7, maybe h5, something where it's kingside advance, and so on. Instead, b takes a4 on the board for black, b takes a4, and here Magnus has a very shocking idea. Bishop takes a4, simply giving up the bishop on the a4 square. Now, typically, again, you don't want to give up your light-squared bishop. That piece is just so important for white's attacking chances. For example, that bishop being here lined up on this diagonal. If the e-pawn ever moves, perhaps white goes f4 trying to open the king side. You basically cannot get an attack going without that light-squared bishop on this diagonal. So bishop takes a4, a split-second decision by Magnus Carlsen in this blitz game. And it's the key move. Here's why. After Hans Niemann takes back with the knight, Magnus takes with the rook. Black goes a5, try to lock down the queen side, and the pawn now being defended by the queen. Perfectly fine move. But here's the key difference in this position. That bishop on the b7 square, it is simply biting on granite on d5, and it is never getting back to the c8 square. Or if it is, it's going to take at least two tempos, rook to a8, and then bishop c8. And this gives Magnus Carlsen enough time to get something going on the king side with perhaps knight g3 to f5, perhaps bishop g5, and so on. Here Magnus jumps in with the bishop, pressuring the knight on the f6 square. Magnus playing on both sides of the board here. Now this move puts pressure on the knight. It also sets up rook d to a1, where he can now double up the rooks on the a-file, and from there it's going to be much harder for black to defend that pawn on the a5 square. Now here Hans finds the best idea, knight d7, getting the knight out of the way of the attack. And here Magnus plays a very curious move, bishop e3. Instead, bishop takes e7 may have been the strongest idea. Again, just trading with tempo. Then you follow up with knight g3, intending knight to f5 with a tempo on that rook on the e7 square. Instead, bishop e3 by Magnus. Magnus, I think, trying to maintain the tension in the position at all costs. He's just saying, the more complicated the position, the more likely I am to win against Hans Niemann. I'm just a better player, and I have more experience, no shame to him. But this move was quite a bit weaker, and here Hans Niemann finds the best idea, f5, breaking on the king side, that King's Indian style move, King's Indian defense style move. And here, from this position onwards, this game becomes an absolute dogfight. Both players are just trying to swindle and confuse each other as quickly as they can. So this is going to be some absolute peak chess here. Here Magnus takes on the f5 square. Good move, but then Hans Niemann, knight to f6, pressuring the d5 pawn with the knight. Now, of course, there is literally no good way to defend the pawn. The queen can't get there. The knights can't get there. The dark squared bishop obviously can't get there. And that means white's going to lose his key central pawn on d5. So what does Magnus do about it? He starts knight g3, developing the knight. Instead, the immediate rook d to a1 may have been a little bit more precise, as the knight on g3 isn't really doing that much yet. Now here Hans takes on d5 with the knight. Magnus goes rook d to a1, pressuring the a5 pawn. Good move. And now Hans Niemann, he has a few different options. For example, taking on e3, certainly possible here. Instead, bishop to f8. What is the idea of this move? You don't defend the pawn on a5. You don't take the bishop. Honestly, I'm not too sure what the idea of this move was. Now Magnus takes on a5. And here Hans Niemann, knight to f4. Now this move lays a trap. Hans Niemann is just begging Magnus Carlsen to take on f4 with the knight. Bishop takes f4 would be a massive blunder. Obviously, after e takes f4, you have a double attack on the queen with the rook and on the knight with the pawn. That would be game over. However, as long as Magnus doesn't play bishop takes f4, this turns out to be a massive mistake. Here, Magnus Carlsen finds the best move, queen d1. And now here, the queen is out of the attack of the knight. Bishop takes f4 is a threat, as the queen is no longer on the e-file with the rook. And beyond that, Magnus maintains all of the pluses in his position. Now here, Hans is basically forced to jump into the d3 square. Knight d3 is what he plays. Of course, knight d5 coming back with the knight isn't possible, as white can simply play rook takes d5, winning the two minor pieces and only giving up the rook. For example, rook takes, then bishop takes, then queen takes. So that would not be a good idea. Instead, knight d3 on the board for Hans Niemann, but now Magnus, he has a wide variety of very, very good moves here. For example, rook a7, pinning the bishop is great. Even moves like f6, trying to sacrifice a pawn, believe it or not, work out. Instead, knight g5 on the board for Magnus. The idea, he's eyeing those light squares on the king side. He may also want to follow up with the move queen to h5. This is one of the benefits of keeping this queen on this diagonal. From there, he's threatening perhaps queen f7 or queen takes h7 ideas. Now here, Hans Niemann, he does not stop trying to swindle Magnus. Queen to c6, threatening checkmate in one move on the g2 square. The audacity of this man in this match. Now Magnus defends. Knight 3 to e4, a good move, but now the knights are overloaded. And here Hans Niemann just goes h6. And now what the heck is Magnus supposed to do? Obviously, if he goes knight to f3 or knight to e6, queen takes e4 is the move, winning a knight, again threatening checkmate in one move. You can't move the knight, but if you don't move the knight, what the heck are you supposed to do? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to figure out the winning idea for Magnus Carlsen. It is absolutely brilliant. Now I'm going to give you a hint. He actually didn't find it in the game, but this move is so unbelievable, and it does occur repeatedly in this game. I do want to mention it right here, right now. So I hope you found it. If you did, you deserve 5 Happy Meals, my friend. The winning idea here, or the best idea here for Magnus, is rook to a6, a truly brilliant move. All right, what's the idea? First of all, if you take with the queen, obviously the rook captures the queen. If you take with the bishop, then queen to h5. This move is insane, and if black takes the knight, you recapture with the other knight, and suddenly queen h7 is threatened. Now, this queen to h5 idea has to occur after bishop takes a6, because now the bishop and the queen are not threatening checkmate on g2. That way, if black takes on g5, knight takes g5 wins for white, as there's no checkmating threat. That is the key idea. Instead, if you don't take the rook on a6, say queen d7, then all the same, queen h5, and if black takes on g5, then knight takes g5, you're threatening checkmate on h7, it's very, very hard for black to defend this. So overall, rook to a6 was an absolutely insane idea by Magnus Carlsen if he found it in that position, and he didn't. Instead, he makes a big mistake, queen to g4. Hans Niemann's swindling ideas are paying off in the game. Now he takes on g5, white takes back on g5, and here, Hans Niemann is up a piece, and if the queen ever moves off g4, queen takes g2, checkmate is still a threat. Hans Niemann has outswindled Magnus Carlsen so far in this game. Unbelievable. Here Hans, bishop b7, putting pressure on the knight on the g5 square. But knight to e6, Magnus jumping in with the knight, that knight a monster, and now Magnus threatening checkmate on g7 as the bishop no longer controls the g7 square. Of course, Hans has an idea. Bishop f6 defends g7 for now, but then bishop g5, trying to deflect the bishop away. Here Hans takes on g5, white takes back, and here in this position, Hans Niemann has a critical decision. Once again, checkmate is being threatened in one move. This is a blitz game. You don't want to miss that. So now here, what should Hans Niemann be doing? In the game, he makes a very sensible decision. Rook to e7. Now, obviously here, the rook is not hanging. It defends g7, and if white takes on e7, then queen takes g2, again, is checkmate in one move. Hans Niemann, these swindling ideas never stop. But rook to e7 turns out to be a little bit of a mistake for Hans Niemann. Instead, the key idea for black is unbelievable. You actually need to give up the exchange. Rook takes e6. What's the idea? After f takes e6, you just go rook to e8. You're going to win this pawn back on the e6 square. White's attack is over. His rooks on the queen side are nowhere near close enough to the king to do any damage. Obviously, no g7 checkmating ideas. Black still has the bishop and the queen. That knight on d3 is a monster. And once the rook wins the pawn on the e6 square, it can shuffle over along the 6th rank and cause havoc on white's king side. So giving up the exchange, knowing you're up a piece, stopping the attack, and getting your own attack going with monster pieces, that would have been the best idea for Hans, and that may even have been enough to win the game. Instead, rook to e7 on the board for Hans Niemann, and now Magnus Carlsen. He finds the idea. Rook to a6, the brilliant move. Now, we saw this move before. The idea is a little bit different here. Obviously, there is no queen takes g7 idea or something like that. Here, if black takes the rook, which he did not do in the game, then you hang the rook on the e7 square, once again, as there is no checkmate threat on the g2 square. So, brilliant idea, rook to a6. Instead, here, black has to go queen d7, getting the queen out of the attack. But then Magnus, rook b6. The rook is now safe. The queen is now no longer threatening queen takes g2. That's an objectively good thing. But beyond that, there's no weird blunder, or then you get checkmated threat. And this is blitz. Anything can happen in blitz game between Magnus and Hans. So excellent idea from Magnus Carlsen. And here, black has to find the right response. Turns out here, you got to get the bishop out of the attack. Bishop d5 is the key move. You're setting up bishop takes e6 threats. And from there, again, Hans will still be better. Instead, bishop c6 on the board. Why would he go to c6 instead of d5? Well, it's a blitz game. Things happen here. Now, in this position, Magnus has a one shot, and again, he misses. And this move was absolutely insane. You may as well deserve 10 Happy Meals if you can find this move. So if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find this one for Magnus Carlsen. It is sick. Here, the idea, rook takes c6, giving up the rook. And if you take it, there's these different checkmating ideas no matter what. For example, queen takes c6, then queen takes e7, threatening mate in one. Instead, the better move is rook takes c6, but then rook to a8 is devastating. For example, again, rook c8, rook takes queen takes e7, again threatening checkmate on g7, and it's game over effectively. So rook takes c6, giving up the rook for the knight to basically checkmate black on the spot. That would have been the winning idea. Instead, he goes rook a to a6. Not a bad idea at all, increasing the pressure on c6. And here Hans Niemann, he messes it up. Knight to f4, a blunder. And now Magnus, he just jumps in with the rook. Rook takes c6. The pair of rooks comes off the board. Obviously, queen takes c6 is met by queen takes e7. And what is Hans Niemann going to do? He takes on the e6 square. Magnus takes back. Now Hans takes on e6, but then rook takes c4,
winning the pawn. Now, of course, if queen takes c4, Magnus wins the rook on the e7 square, and that is what happens. And now we have a queen and pawn endgame. Magnus is up 2 pawns. Of course, the key pawns being those ones on the queen side, and beyond that, his king is also quite a bit safer. His king having those 3 pawns on the king side versus the 1 of Hans Niemann. So now, how does Magnus Carlsen finish the game, or does he finish off at all? Here, Hans Niemann, queen d5. Now Magnus finds an excellent rerouting idea. Queen to e8. The idea is you go to e8, then h4 with check, then e2. Here's the idea in action. Queen e8, queen h4, queen to e2. The queen defends the pawn on the b2 square, and there's nothing black can do to stop the pawns. Hans tries to get something going in the center, but then b4, followed by queen c4, queen d4, and finally b5. And in this position, Hans Niemann had enough. There is no way to stop that pawn from simply rolling down the board. And here on move 48, Hans Niemann resigned to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a last game that was. And now in our next game here, Hans Niemann is playing as white. He opens 24, and here Magnus throws a big curveball. You don't want to miss this. He goes for the modern defense with the move g6, and I'm giving this move 2 exclamation points for style points. And if you don't like it, cry me a river in the comment section. I'm going with it. 2 exclamation points right here. Now Hans Niemann d4. Magnus goes d6. Already a little bit weird. Instead, bishop g7 was the standard idea. Let's see what he has in mind. Here, d6 on the board. Hans knight c3, very standard. And now c6. Okay, this is a little bit of a Magnus Carlsen specialty. He really likes doing this. My most popular video was Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen. In that game, Alireza went f4. And then Magnus Carlsen absolutely loves this line as black, where you go d5, and if white goes e5, you go h5 with the idea of going h4, and maybe even knight a6 to c7 to e6 to g7, which Magnus Carlsen did in that one game versus Alireza Firouzja. Now, in the game, Hans Niemann does not fall for this trap. It's not a trap, but it's a very tricky line Magnus likes to play. Instead, here he goes knight to f3, staying in complete control. Magnus knight to f6, transposing back to a Pyrrhic defense. Of course, the modern is where you don't go knight to f6, and the Pyrrhic is where you do play that move. Now here Hans, a4, expanding on the queen side. I guess he was nervous about b5 ideas. Again, in this match so far, Hans playing super conservative as white, trying to stay in control as much as possible. Now Magnus bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, castles, and knight d7. So far, very, very standard development. This is the most classical way to develop as white. Bishop e2 is short castles, and black basically doing the same. He's ready to perhaps counterattack in the center with the move e5. From there, he will be a little bit worse, but overall, it's a relatively respectable position for Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Hans Niemann, bishop e3 played in the game. I was a little bit surprised when I saw him play this move. I thought he would go h3 first. The idea being h3 stops knight g4 ideas from black. If you go bishop e3 first, as he did in the game, knight g4 is possible, trying to win the bishop pair. Then Hans can go bishop g5 or bishop c1, and it's a little bit crazy, but Magnus didn't play this in the game. Instead, queen c7. Okay, setting up e5 ideas still. Hans goes h3, stopping knight g4. Very good. And then instead of e5, the most standard move you can make in this position as black, trying to fight for the center, here Magnus goes b6. So this is his big idea in this game. He's staying very passive on the 6th rank, all of his pawns on the 7th or 6th rank so far, and he's just kind of waiting for Hans Niemann to make a mistake, and he's trying to make the game very confusing and unusual for his opponent. So again, when you're Magnus Carlsen, literally the GOAT, and you're playing Hans Niemann, a guy you don't have much respect for, you like to play these weird openings sometimes. This is kind of how it goes. Now here Hans, queen d2, standard idea, setting up bishop h6 ideas in the future, trying to get rid of black's dark squared bishop on g7. At that point, his dark squares will be a lot weaker around the king side. Now Magnus, bishop b7, the main idea of b6, so far so good for Magnus. Now Hans, rook d1, a somewhat committal move. Instead, if you wanted to play him on the king side, then rook a d1 or rook e1 would have been the move. Instead, now, after rook fd1, it's going to be very hard for him to get at any sort of e5 or f4 idea in the future. So, it doesn't look like a very big deal, but going rook f to d1 instead of rook a d1 does limit his options on the king side, However, his queenside play, maybe with a5 in the future, is a little more promising. Now here, Magnus a6, expanding on the queenside. Now here with a6, Magnus Carlsen is threatening the idea of b5, expanding further on the queenside. That pawn would be supported by the a6 pawn. So here, Hans Niemann, he kind of actually has to do something. All of his pieces are on excellent squares, his bishops, queen, minor pieces, his rooks. But you can't win a chess game just by sitting back and waiting, especially as white. So here, the best move for Hans is actually a temporary pawn sacrifice, e5. Now, this is the move you want to play as white in this kind of position. And here it actually works because of black's last move, a6. That move, a6, leaves the pawn on b6 defended only by the queen, and you can capitalize on that. Here's how. The move is e5. You break in the center, then black takes on e5, and here black is attacking the pawn with the queen and the knight. However, if black takes advantage of that with knight takes, then queen takes, that is the best sequence for black. Then you jump in with the bishop to the b6 square. Bishop takes b6. Suddenly, you regain the pawn, but black's pawn structure on the queen side is just destroyed. Yours is not. And beyond that, that bishop on b7 is not doing a whole lot right now. And of course, c5 would be problematic for black as well. So here, Hans Niemann would have a very stable long-term advantage if he found the key move e5 in response to black's a6, which does set up that weakness on the b6 square. Now, instead, in the game, he goes bishop to f4. So this is a very solid idea. The idea behind bishop f4 is he is threatening e5 without losing a pawn. However, the drawback, if Magnus does go e5 right away, as he did in the game, then the pawn is defended. I mean, here Hans can take on e5, he did in the game, but now the bishop has to retreat back to the e3 square. So overall, this does play into Magnus Carlsen's hand here, and now we have sort of a King's Indian defense style structure. Black does have that pawn on e5. His pawns on the queen side are a little bit vulnerable, but overall, he's doing relatively okay. Now here, the best idea for black is going to be b5, immediately expanding on the queen side. The idea being you want to stop bishop c4 from white. If white can get bishop c4 in, then that bishop on c4, and potentially you can go knight g5, try to gang up on that pawn on f7, and overall that bishop will be much more active on this diagonal here than it is on e2. So b5, the best idea for black. However, Magnus doesn't see it. He goes rook to e8, a little bit of a problematic move. So first of all, you allow bishop c4, b5 isn't there to stop it, and then beyond that, that bishop is eyeing the vulnerable f7 square, and again, knight g5 ideas are now possible. So what does Magnus Carlsen do? He goes b5, this is a good move, objectively a good move. Here, Hans Niemann retreats the bishop, bishop b3. There was a stronger idea here, a takes b4 that he missed, so, blitz game, these things happen. Bishop b3 on the board. And now this is where the fireworks start in this game. I told you these were the six best games from this series. Magnus goes for on the queen side with the move b4. Now the idea behind this move is very simple. The knight doesn't really have a good square. For example, going to a2 or b1 looks ridiculous. e2 isn't all that great either because now the f5 and the h5 squares are covered by this g-pawn. And if he goes knight to e2, then g3, the knight really isn't doing that much. So here, Hans Niemann, he finds a creative solution. Knight g5. Yes, this is a knight sacrifice. Chess C2, don't even try to argue with me on this one. I know you guys love to point out that sometimes sacrifices aren't sacrifices. Well, you're wrong in this case. This is a knight sacrifice. That knight on c3 is going down. And here, what should Magnus do? Well, the best computer move is going to be rook to f8, just defending. Then the knight has to go back to, say, a2 or b1 or e2. And again, it's depressing for white. But Magnus Carlsen, he is not interested in playing the quote-unquote best moves. No, instead, he does not go rook f8. He actually just takes the knight on the c3 square. B takes c3 on the board. And now, of course, the queen is being attacked. But Hans has the intermediate move. Bishop takes f7, winning the pawn. So now the king has to go somewhere. AJ's the best square. You don't want to go to f8 and then allow future knight h7 or other craziness. Instead, h8 on the board. Now, of course, the pawn on c3 is attacking the queen. Queen takes c3 is the move. And now rook e7 getting out of the attack. And finally, bishop b3 getting the bishop to safety. All right, those last few moves were sort of forced. I mean, yes, both sides had some different options they had, but everything was being attacked. You can't ignore the attack on the queen or the bishop or anything else. So what's going on here? Let's look at material first of all. Here, Magnus Carlsen has the 4 minor pieces versus the 3 of Hans Niemann. That means Magnus is up a piece. However, Hans Niemann does have 2 extra pawns, the one on the F file and the B file. So overall, Magnus is all about 1 pawn. However, beyond that, Magnus Carlsen's king on H8 is incredibly vulnerable. Knight to F7 ideas are in the air. Hans Niemann controlling the open D file. His queen's better placed. His bishops are better placed. His bishops on B7 and G7 aren't doing anything right now. So despite being down a pawn in, loose terms, Hans Niemann still has the advantage here. And now Magnus, what does he do? He goes H6, begging the knight to jump in to either F7 or E6. Now this was a big mistake. Instead, the computer likes the idea of C5 expanding on the queen side, opening up the bishop attacking on E4, and overall try to restrict White's bishop on E3. Instead, H6 on the board. Now the knight can jump into somewhere. Hans finds the best idea, knight to E6, forking both the queen on C7 and that bishop on G7. Now here, you can't allow something like knight takes G7. If you move the queen, then knight takes G7 is just devastating. Instead, here, Magnus Carlsen takes the knight on the E6 square. Rook takes E6, giving up the rook for the knight. Now bishop takes, and what's his idea? Knight to F8, knocking back the bishop, bishop B3 on the board. Then you take on E4, and then once the queen moves, you jump back to the F6 square. Now here, again, the position is very complicated. The computer seems to think the best idea for White is going to be queen to D6, centralizing the queen, trying to get the queens off the board, off queen takes, rook takes, and from here, White should have the advantage in the endgame. Now instead of this, here White makes a very big mistake in the game. A5, expanding on the queen side. The problem with this move is here Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight, knight D5, and suddenly queen D6 ideas are simply off the table. Now here, of course, Magnus Carlsen has those 2 extra minor pieces versus the extra rook and the pawns of Hans Niemann. And here Magnus is demonstrating his experience. He knows if he can find good places for those minor pieces and keep the rooks inactive, meaning if he can close off these open files for the rooks, then his minor pieces are going to dominate the board. And that is what we see here. Here, Hans Niemann tries to go C4, knocking off that knight off that perfect D5 square. Hans Niemann takes the bishop on E3. Knight takes, queen takes. Now, of course, Magnus has the bishop pair in addition to his other advantages, those bishops being on B7 and G7. And here, Magnus plays a series of excellent moves. C5, activating this bishop on B7 down this diagonal. And 1 move later, E4, activating the other bishop. Now both of his bishops are coming to life. The knight's going to come into E6. Black is looking fantastic, and White here is really struggling. Now from here, Hans Niemann retreats the bishop back to the C2 square. Hans Niemann kind of going back and forth with his pieces. He really doesn't have an active plan here. And Magnus simply defends the pawn on E4, develops the rook. His position looks better and better as the game goes along. Now Hans starts the idea of doubling rooks on the open D file. Good idea. Magnus king H7, Hans rook AD1. And here Magnus just picks up that pawn on the A5 square. A good move. And now how does Hans Niemann justify losing the pawn? He tries to jump in with the rook to the D6 square. Rook D6 on the board. But Magnus just retreats the queen, defending absolutely everything for now. Now a relatively weak move from Hans Niemann, B3, the idea being that pawn on the B2 square was being attacked by the bishop on G7, but overall a little bit of a slow move. B3 doesn't do a whole lot to improve his position. And the big problem with this move is here, Magnus Carlsen, if he finds it, he has a very big tactical shot that can basically decide the game on the spot. This is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to solve this one. There is a beautiful tactical shot from Magnus Carlsen right here. All right, I hope you found the idea. The key move here for Magnus is bishop to E5, forking both the rook on D6 and this F4 square once the rook moves. So, for example, if you take the rook back to the D2 square, rook D2, not a bad move. Then you can give the check on H2, force the king to go to an awkward square, and then retreat back bishop F4, skewering both the queen and the rook. So this was the key idea, bishop to e5 for Magnus Carlsen. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't find it. He sees a different idea. Bishop d4, trying to cut off the communication of the rook on the d6 square. Here, Hans plays pretty much the only idea. You have to sacrifice the rook on the d4 square. Either rook 6 takes d4 or rook 1 takes d4. Now, in the game, Hans takes with the rook on d1. Rook 1 takes d4, then c takes and queen takes. And now queen to e7 for Magnus Carlsen, increasing the defense of that pawn on the e4 square. So far, he has absolutely everything under control. Now Hans, c5. He's trying to push his queenside pawn up the board, ideally to promote on the c8 square. Can Magnus defend the idea? Well, here he actually makes a big mistake. He goes e3, trying to expand that pawn in the center. Now, the idea, of course, is if white takes on e3, black will recapture with the queen and force the queens off the board. That sort of happens. F takes e3, but now Magnus, instead of queen takes e3, the best idea by far, here he goes queen to g5. Now, Magnus does have an idea here, obviously threatening checkmate in one move on the g2 square, but Hans Niemann is ready. c6, blocking the bishop on this diagonal here and stopping the threat. Now, the bishop has to go back to the c8 square. There's nowhere else. a8 will be a terrible square for the bishop. And now rook to f6 for Hans Niemann. Hans trying to increase the pressure on the king side. Now, from here, the king gets off this diagonal with the bishop, king g8 on the board. But then Hans, bishop d3, setting up bishop c4 threats, once again trying to target that king on g8. Now here, Magnus, he has had enough. He plays the queen move, queen takes e3, trying to force the queens off the board. That is what happens. Queen takes and then rook takes on e3. But here, Hans is still doing all right. He gives the check on the c4 square, bishop c4, hitting the king on g8. Now, instead of king h7, here the knight goes to the e6 square, stopping the check. That's a little bit of a weird move, self-pitting the knight to the king. However, Magnus does have an idea. Here, the best move for Hans Niemann is going to be rook takes g6, winning the pawn with check. However, he doesn't find it. Instead, c7 on the board. This was a fatal mistake, and here Magnus Carlsen just plays king g7. And now look at this. If the rook moves, the knight on the e6 square is going to fall, as it's currently being defended by the bishop and the rook, whereas black attacks twice. So what is Hans Niemann going to do? In the game, bishop takes e6 is the move, but then rook takes e6, and after rook to f3 from Hans Niemann, here Magnus, rook c6. He is up a clean bishop. That pawn on c7 is going to fall. There is literally no way to save the game. And in this position, Hans Niemann resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus in the modern defense, but don't go anywhere. This next game is even crazier. All right, diving into our fifth game of the match, Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. If you like the London system or wild attacking chess, you don't want to miss this game because this game was crazy. Here, Magnus is playing as white. He opens with the London system with the key move bishop to f4. Now, this is a great opening for blitz. Magnus loves the London system. Of course, the idea is to go knight to f3, e3, bishop e2, castles, c3, have that pawn triangle in the middle of the board, and have a very easy game no matter what black does. Here, typically Hans Niemann does go for the line starting with move d5, followed by c5, but here he mixes things up. He goes for the move g6. Now, this is a more combative idea, at least in more imbalanced positions, but Hans Niemann typically doesn't play this way as black in this opening. Now here, Magnus, knight to f3, bishop g7, e3, castles, bishop e2. So far, super standard. Again, white's plan is simple. c3, castles, knight d2, a4, h3, all typical London system moves. But now here, black has to define what he's doing. Obviously, Hans Niemann is already castled, but now how is he going to get his counterplay going on the queen side and in the center? It's a few different ideas. For example, one idea is c5. That's very popular. Another idea is going d6, knight c6, and e5, trying to break in the center with that pawn chain on d6 and e5. Instead, Hans goes for a different idea, a slower approach, b6, intending bishop b7, fianchettoing the bishop on this long diagonal. Now, how does Magnus respond? He castles, and then he goes a4, expanding on the queen side. Now, this is a typical London system move. Of course, Magnus would normally follow up, say, h3, c3, knight d2, but he has a completely different idea in mind. Here, Hans Niemann, d6, standard idea,
It's a good multi-purpose move. He may want to break on the queen side with c5 or in the center with e5 after, say, knight c6 or knight d7. But here, Magnus shows his idea. Instead of going for a more typical move like c3, he actually expands further on the queen side with the move a5. Now, this is already a little bit strange. This idea was popularized by the very powerful Google computer engine called AlphaZero, especially in his match during Stockfish. Here, Magnus Carlsen is actually threatening the idea of a6, trying to lock in that bishop back on the c8 square forever. Of course, if Magnus got that move in a6, it would be supported by both the bishop and the rook on the a1 square, meaning that move would actually work. And here, Hans Niemann ignores the threat. He goes knight d7. And this is a big mistake. Instead, he had to go simply knight to a6, blocking the pawn immediately. Instead, after knight d7, here Magnus again shows his idea. a6, the AlphaZero inspired move. Now the bishop has to move off this square here. Where's it going to go? If it goes to, say, c6, it's going to block that c7 pawn in forever. That's going to be terrible. Instead, bishop c8 is virtually forced, but now the bishop is blocked out of the game. The rook on the a8 square is also trapped. And here, Magnus Carlsen has a free hand to do pretty much whatever he wants in this position. Now, again, the standard idea would have been here c3, trying to get that pawn triangle in the middle of the board, staying safe and solid. However, because of this imbalance with the move a6 and the bishop being trapped, here Magnus can actually play for a very fast e4 break with the move knight to c3, and that is what he finds. Here again, the idea potentially e4, potentially also d5, try to clamp down on those light squares. Of course, Black's light squares on the queen side are so much weaker because of this a6 pawn wedge here. But here already, Magnus Carlsen already has a completely dominant position, at least from a positional perspective. Now, Hans Niemann, he's not out of the game. What does he do here? Well, he takes advantage of the fact that White has not played the move h3 yet. Normally, that move is played in the London system to give the bishop a retreat square on h2 if Black goes knight to h5. However, here, without that move h3 on the board, knight to h5 is actually very, very strong. If White loses that dark squared bishop, his dark squares in the position are going to be so much weaker. So here, Magnus has to go bishop g5. Again, if you go bishop g3, then I can simply take it on the g3 square, and Black's going to have a pretty decent game. Instead, bishop g5 on the board, the best move. Now Hans Niemann goes h6. Obviously, you don't want to go that Ben Feingold move f6. That would be way too weakening, and e5 is not really possible as that pawn is being pinned by the queen, so nothing there can be played. Instead, h6 on the board, Magnus goes back, bishop h4, and here there are a lot of threats based on discovered attacks on that knight on the h5 square. For example, if Hans Niemann goes g5, then Magnus Carlsen could take it on g5 or go something like knight d2 with a discovered attack on the knight as it's no longer defended by the g-pawn. And funnily enough, that is what Hans Niemann does here. He actually goes g5, and this is a big mistake. Real fast, instead of that, perhaps the best idea may have been c6, trying to shore up those light squares, maybe going d5 next. Instead, g5 on the board, and here Magnus has at least two really good ways to punish this move. The strongest idea, believe it or not, is knight takes g5, and the idea is not to try and win a knight on the h5 square. You basically go knight takes and then bishop takes, and you have a very vicious attack here as White. Black's pieces, especially those pieces on the queen side, are just way too passive, and White may be able to drum up a winning mating attack here. Instead, Magnus goes for the other option, just staying in control, a very good move, knight d2. Now, if Hans Niemann takes the bishop on the h4 square, then Magnus can win the knight on the h5 square, and then Black's pawn structure will be completely shattered. Now, there isn't really much else he can do. For example, if he retreats the knight back to the f6 square, then Magnus just goes bishop g3, and here Black's pawn structure on the king side with those pawns on h6 and g5 will be so much weaker. So instead, g takes h4 on the board, and Magnus takes the knight on the h5 square. Now here, Hans Niemann's pawns are incredibly weak. There are some lines of the king's Indian defense, especially when White goes for the move 3, f3, or the same-ish variation, and you reach sort of a Benini structure. Then this pawn structure with those pawns on h6 and h4 can be okay, as Black may have attacking chances with the pawn going to h3. But here, that is simply not the case, and Hans Niemann, again, is positioned going from bad to worse. Now again, he's not out of the game. Here he finds the best idea, c6, intending perhaps d5 next, trying to shore up those weakened light squares on the queen side. So excellent idea. Here Magnus retreats the bishop, bishop f3, bishop no longer being well placed on the h5 square, so it just goes back to a better square. Good idea. And then Hans d5. Again, excellent idea, trying to shore up those weakened light squares. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he's feeling ambitious. He wants to break in the center. He goes for it with the move e4. The solid idea, of course, if black takes, white can recapture with either knight and have pretty good control over the center of the board, and black's pawns are still going to be weak. Now here, Hans Niemann, instead of taking, he goes e6. Now, this move is technically playable, but it's a little bit passive. Now, d takes e4 was not the best idea. Again, Magnus can recapture with either knight with a terrific game. Instead, the key idea for black, believe it or not, is the move e5. Just trying to blow open the center right away. And remember here, black does have the bishop pair. If he can open up the position, his bishops are going to be incredibly powerful. And it turns out, if he found this move e5 right here, he would have had a roughly level game. Instead, e6 on the board. Now, the problem with this move is Magnus Carlsen can simply expand in the center with the move e5. Then we reach sort of a French defense-style structure. However, this would be very favorable for Magnus Carlsen. Black's pawns on the king side are weak. That pawn on the queen side restricts black's bishop. There's no good way to try and win the pawn. It would take too much time. So here, white's always going to have that threat of e5 in the future. Now, e5 right away isn't as strong. Here, black actually gets a great game right away with the move c5, trying to undermine white's center. However, Magnus can prepare this move, and he does, with the idea knight to e2. Now his center is just way better supported. He always has that resource c3, bolstering the d4 pawn if he needs to bolster it in the future. And now he is ready for that e5 idea. Now here, Hans, instead of sitting back and waiting for the inevitable, he latches out on the king side, queen to g5. Not the best move, but I actually like this from a practical standpoint. This is a blitz game. The initiative is everything. Maybe Hans Niemann can make use of that pawn on the h4 square, perhaps going h3 at some point. So I like this idea. Now Magnus, rook to e1, Hans Niemann, king to h8. And here, Magnus shows his flair. He finds a very creative idea. Not the strongest computer move, but I really like this move. Rook to a3, transferring the rook up to the third rank, a rook lift, and now the rook can swing over to the king side at some point in the future. So there are just all sorts of scenarios where this rook move could be incredibly useful. It's a very good idea to keep in mind for your own games. Now here, Hans Niemann goes knight to f6, trying to transfer the knight over to the king side. However, this move jumps into the idea e5. This hits the knight with tempo. Magnus didn't find this in the game, but that would have been super, super strong. Instead here, Magnus g3, trying to stop any ideas on this g-file, stopping h3 ideas, just trying to stay safe and solid. Now here, Hans Niemann, he can make use of that knight on the f6 square. The key idea is knight takes e4. However, he misses that, bishop d7, and this is a very weak idea. The knight no longer has access to the d7 square as it's occupied by the bishop. Magnus spots this immediately and goes for it e5, the best move. Now here, his position went from good to amazing. Where is the knight going to go? Literally all of these squares here are absolutely awful. If the knight goes to h5, it's going to be vulnerable. The bishop takes h5 ideas in the future. Where is Hans going to put the knight? In the game, he goes knight g8, about as good a move as any. And now Magnus simply bishop g2, an excellent idea. Here's one of the ideas of the move. If black ever goes h takes g3, you don't have to respond f takes or h takes. Instead, you can actually go rook takes g3, and suddenly you're the one attacking black on the king side, not the other way around. And that is what happens here. G takes, and then rook takes g3 from Magnus Carlsen, the best idea, showing the full idea of rook to a3 in the first place. Now, of course, there is no way to block the attack. Black has to move the queen back. Queen to e7 looks as good as any other move. But now, knight to f4, Magnus threatening knight to h5, and if he gets that move in uncontested, that bishop on the g7 square, believe it or not, there is literally no way here for Hans Niemann to defend the piece. And that is what happens in the game. Queen to h4 from Hans Niemann, and then Magnus knight to h5, threatening either knight takes or rook takes on g7,
The bishop can't move. The only square it has is f6, and then it gets lost to either e takes or knight takes, and there's no way for Hans Niemann to defend the piece. So for that reason, he's losing a piece on the spot, and here Hans Niemann on move 25 resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a display by Magnus, but don't go anywhere. The last game features that new opening that I teased in the intro. All right, it's the final game of the match, Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. This is the game where Magnus Carlsen plays a brand new opening. It's shocking, and this is my favorite game of the match. The entire game is insane, all the way up until the very end. Here, Magnus opens a3. Of course, this has been played before. So far, so good. Hans goes e5, striking in the center. Now, knight to c3 from Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus does play this idea a lot. His idea, black goes d5, maybe d4 later. Magnus is actually going to go knight to a2. I've seen Magnus play this so many times, so trust me when I say that is the basic idea. Here, Hans does not go for that. He doesn't go for the move d5. Instead, knight to f6 on the board. Hans Niemann, I'm sure he studied Magnus Carlsen's games. He doesn't want to play into that d5, d4, that knight a2 idea from Magnus. He's too good at that. Now here, Magnus, f4, breaking on the king side, already getting very strange. Here, Hans Niemann can just take the pawn. It is a free pawn. That is the best move, but Hans Niemann doesn't do that. He tries to stay nice and solid. He goes e4, expanding in the center. Again, not playing into Magnus Carlsen's games. And here a couple different moves have been played, but no one has ever played the strongest idea. Magnus Carlsen here goes d3, and on move 4, we have a brand new game that has never been played before in the history of chess. This is a novelty, and this is Magnus Carlsen's new opening on move 4, trying to go f4 and then breaking in the center with the move d3. All right, let's see how it plays out from here. Black takes on d3, and now technically the computer says you can go for a crazy pawn sacrifice starting with e4, and then if d takes c2, queen takes c2. However, instead, Magnus c takes d3 is the move. Hans goes d5. Magnus goes e4, striking in the center. Now Hans has the option of going d4. That would complicate the game massively. Magnus would likely go knight to e2, then knight f3, trying to gang up on the pawn. Black goes c5. Now, instead of that, here Hans again stays nice and solid. He takes on e4, white takes back, then the queens come off the board, and then knight to c6. Now, don't worry, this endgame is the most exciting endgame you will see all year. Trust me when I say that. This game was played in bullet time control, so literally 1 second per move. Here we go. Magnus, knight to f3, Hans, bishop c5, solid idea, potentially wanting to go knight d4 in the future. Now here, of course, if Magnus goes king to c2, then knight d4 is going to be an idea. Instead, Magnus plays sort of a waiting move, h3. The idea is Hans Niemann could threaten knight g4 and then knight to f2 check, forking the king and the rook at some point. So h3 does block that idea permanently, so very solid idea. Now here, Hans, bishop e6, setting up long castles with the check on the king with the rook on the d8 square. So very solid. Magnus gets out of the way of that, king c2, then long castles, then Magnus f5, putting pressure on that bishop, forcing it to go back. Now here, Hans Niemann, his best move is potentially just bishop d7, retreating bishop. But he doesn't do that. This is a bullet game, of course. Instead, he jumps in with the knight. Knight takes e4. Now, this move does have an idea. Here, of course, if Magnus takes the knight on e4, then Hans Niemann goes bishop takes f5 with the pin on the knight, and then black is going to win back the piece and have those two pawns. That would be a massive advantage. Instead, here Magnus finds the best move. It is definitely not knight takes e4. Instead, it's the intermediate move, f takes e6. What's the idea here? Well, it's simple. If black takes on the c3 square with the knight, white's going to recapture with the b-pawn, and he's going to have a perfectly fine game with a very nice advantage. Instead, here Hans tries to complicate things right away. Knight g3, forking both the bishop and the rook on the h1 square. The rook looks like it has to go somewhere, maybe h2, but instead Magnus e takes f7, giving up the rook on the h1 square. Knight takes h1 from Hans, and this game is getting insanely complicated. Here, Hans Niemann is up a rook. Magnus has the extra minor piece. However, that pawn on the f7 square is incredibly dangerous, and that gives Magnus the advantage. Now here, Magnus, bishop c4, a good move.
The threat now, of course, is bishop g5 with the double attack on the rook on the d8 square, and the rook on a1 hits the knight on the h1 square. If Magnus Carlsen gets that in, he would be simply winning here. Now, Hans Niemann, knight g3. Excellent move, getting the knight out of the attack preemptively. That is literally the only idea you could do. Now, Magnus, bishop f4, keeping up the pressure, hitting the knight on the g3 square. Knight to h5. Hans hits the bishop back. Bishop g5, pressuring the rook on d8. Then knight to f6, blocking the attack. Now, Magnus, rook e1, activating the rook, potentially setting up rook to e8 ideas in the future. Of course, not viable right now, but excellent idea. Now, Hans, rook f8, blocking the pawn on the f7 square. There are no f8 ideas immediately. Now here, Magnus, he increases the pressure right away. Knight to e4, pressuring the knight on the f6 square, setting up knight takes or bishop takes ideas. Now Hans, he defends, bishop e7, and here we have a critical position. Here, the best idea for Magnus, this is almost impossible to find in a bullet game, is first you go bishop e6, driving back the king to the b8 square, then you retreat the knight back to g3, setting up knight to f5 ideas. And if that knight gets over here to the f5 square, that would be incredibly strong, pressuring the bishop, pressuring the g7 pawn. Now, of course, this is a bullet game. Magnus goes for the simpler option. Knight takes f6. Hans takes back with the bishop. Then Magnus takes on f6 again with the bishop. Hans takes back. And here, again, we have that position where Hans Niemann is up the exchange. He has the rook for the extra bishop of Magnus Carlsen, but that pawn on the f7 square is so strong that it does mean Magnus Carlsen still has roughly level chances in this game. Now here, Magnus Carlsen has a whole bunch of decent ideas. For example, king c3, almost anything else is playable. Instead, Magnus Carlsen blunders. He goes rook to e6. What's the problem with this move? Well, it looks logical. You are pressuring the f6 pawn. If you get rook takes f6 in the game, you're going to be doing great. However, Hans Niemann, in a bullet game, finds the key move instantly, knight to a5, putting pressure on that bishop on the c4 square. Now, here's the problem. If that bishop goes back to, say, d3 or e2, then the move rook takes f7 is possible. Hans Niemann wins the pawn. Then he's going to be up the exchange and a pawn, and he just wins. Instead, bishop a2, Magnus has to keep this bishop on this diagonal. Now the threat, of course, is if rook takes f7, perhaps there's going to be something else with a discovered attack once the rook moves. However, rook takes f7 anyway, and currently there are no good discovered attacks. All right, Magnus, b4, pressuring the knight. He's trying to force knight to c6, and then you take on c6 with the rook with a discovered attack on the rook on the f7 square. For example, if Hans Niemann blunders and goes knight to c6, then rook takes, b takes, bishop takes f7, and here Magnus has those two minor pieces versus the rook of Hans Niemann. That would be enough to win the game. However, Hans Niemann, he doesn't fall for that trap. He finds the best move, rook g7. This move is so incredibly strong. Here, if Magnus Carlsen takes the knight on the a5 square, then rook takes g2 hits with check, and suddenly Hans Niemann's rooks are flying into the game, and he's doing excellent. Now here, Magnus, g4, stops the rook takes g2 idea. Very good. Now knight c6, and now here is the difference. Rook takes c6 is not possible because the rook on the g7 square is out of the attack of the bishop on the a2 square. That means, of course, rook takes b takes doesn't work. Bishop takes f7 isn't possible. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he's just down a massive amount of material. All right, Magnus picks up the pawn on the f6 square. Best idea. Rook e7 from Hans, getting the rook back to a better file here. Of course, the g file being blocked off by that pawn on the g4 square. And now Magnus finds the best idea. Bishop e6, blocking the rook and forcing king b8 ideas from Hans Niemann. Now, of course, here, Hans Niemann plays the key move, king to b8. He plays the key move, king to b8. Hans Niemann didn't play king b8. Instead, in this position, he played rook takes e6. He gives up the rook for the bishop for absolutely no reason. It's a bullet game. Crazy things happen. Now the game is level. Both sides have the four pawns, the rook and the knight. It is literally anyone's game. Magnus is going to try to push his pawn through on the king side here. Hans Niemann on the queen side. Let's see what happens. All right, rook f8, hitting the rook on the f3 square. Excellent move. If the knight moves anywhere, say knight g5, then knight d4 wins the game on the spot with the double attack on the king and the rook. So The knight cannot move. Here, Magnus finds the only idea, b5. Of course, the idea is if you take the knight, then you win this knight. And if the knight moves, then this knight can move as there's no knight d4 threat anymore. Now Hans, he just takes the knight. Rook takes f3. Magnus takes back. Hans takes back on c6. And now we have a rook endgame where both sides have the pawn majority on opposite sides of the board. Again, this is going to be an all-out slugfest to promote a pawn. This is going to be really exciting. All right, Magnus, rook h6, threatening the pawn. He doesn't want to win the pawn on the c6 square. Instead, he wants to win h7 and then just start bulldozing this pawn down the board. Hans Niemann, rook takes a3, g5 for Magnus. He's obviously going to win the pawn on the h7 square. Rook g3 pressures g5, h4. Now Hans Niemann, a5, expanding on the queen side. And Magnus Carlsen finally wins the pawn on the h7 square. Now both sides have 2 to 3 pawns on opposite sides of the board. Again, this is just an all-out blitz, bullet, slugfest here. Hans Niemann getting his pawn going on the queen side. Magnus pressuring c6. Hans Niemann pushing his c-pawn. Now g6, a3, h5. Both sides going for it. c4 for Hans Niemann. Of course, the king is being cut off on the third rank by the rook. There's nothing Magnus Carlsen can do right now to stop the advance of those pawns. Magnus Carlsen, rook h8, hitting the king, then transfer the rook to the f8 square, potentially setting up ideas like rook f7, then g7, h6, h7, g8. He's got to keep pushing those pawns. Now Hans gives the king a check, driving it back to the back rank. Of course, if he went to, say, c3, then a2, and it's almost impossible to stop that pawn. So instead of that, king b1 played here in the game. Now c3. Hans Niemann setting up ideas based on perhaps c2 or a2, trying to deflect the king, then pushing forward with the other pawn down the board. Now Magnus, he makes a massive mistake. Rook to f1. What's the problem with this move? Well, Hans Niemann finds the only flaw. c2 check, hitting the king. Now, if the king goes to the c1 square, a2 virtually wins by force. For example, if the king goes to b2, then the winning combination, this is beautiful, c1 queen with a double attack on the king. That means you literally have to take the queen here, and then a1 queen is checkmate. Brilliant idea. So instead of king c1, here Magnus has to go king to a1. And then rook d2, the winning idea, setting up rook d1 threats. Now Magnus, he's not out yet. He has one last trick up his sleeve. g7, threatening to promote immediately if he gets that queen without getting checkmated. That queen could come flying back into the game, start giving checks to the king on the b7 square, and he's going to be just fine. Now, Hans Niemann, rook d1. Of course, if you take the rook, that is game over. As the queen promotes with check, it comes flying over, winning all the pawns. Nothing you can do. So, king a2 for Magnus. Now c1 queen. Hans Niemann is literally one move away from delivering checkmate. Magnus, he takes the rook on the d1 square. Now, this is the big swindle. If Hans Niemann takes the rook on d1, then g8 queen, and here there is no checkmate, and Hans Niemann has nothing more than a draw. Of course, Magnus with that outside pass pawn here. Now, instead, Hans Niemann on move 45. He does not fall for it. He does not take the rook. Instead, queen to b2 delivers the checkmate. What an unbelievable game and a brand new opening idea by Magnus Carlsen. Both sides playing unbelievably well. And yes, this was a video about Magnus Carlsen destroying Hans Niemann. I hope the first 5 games satisfied you with that, but I just had to throw in this final game of Magnus Carlsen and his new opening. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, Chess YouTube, if you love this video, please show me some love. Like the video, subscribe, and comment down below what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want to see me cover in my next videos. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. It's got all of his latest games, his openings. I think you're going to love it. And I will see you in the next video.